Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in 10 plus years. Today, it's the Sunday after Easter Sunday, and I want to finish up John 21, my Easter series. By the way, I have published explanatory notes on Jesus' resurrection. It's available on Amazon. Basically, it gives commentary on all four Gospels resurrection accounts. It throws in the Acts 1 ascension, as well as the first verses of 1 Corinthians 15, which is the earliest witness, written witness to the resurrection that we have. But today, we are in John chapter 21. If you're watching the video version on YouTube, we are on interlinearbible.org, so you can see the Greek if you want it. And then, of course, if you're listening to the podcast, you can't. But here we go. We are in John chapter 21. John 21 is a little bit, it comes off a little bit like an epilogue. It's kind of like the Gospel of John feels like it could have ended at the end of chapter 20. And in fact, there are some scholars who think that perhaps there was a compositional history to the Gospel of John, and that John 21 was perhaps added after at a later stage of the development of the gospel. Of course, it's scripture, and we believe it's inspired, and it is part of the canonical Gospel of John as we have it. So no big deal in terms of, however it came together, it is inspired as it is. So let's go ahead and dive into John 21. John 21 occurs in Galilee. Difficult to know where this fits in exactly. The Gospel of Luke, for example, has no resurrection appearances in Galilee, or it doesn't tell about them. Matthew only has resurrection appearances in Galilee. The Great Commission, did this happen after the Great Commission? Did this happen before the Great Commission? That kind of question. Mark, of course, doesn't. The original version of Mark doesn't actually narrate any appearances in Galilee. So difficult to locate it. But we know it's in Galilee, so I assume it's somewhere in the 40-day period between the resurrection and the ascension 40 days later, and certainly before the day of Pentecost. Well, let's go ahead and begin, shall we, with verse 1. After these things, he revealed himself again, that is Jesus, revealed himself again to the disciples on the Sea of Tiberias. Interesting that John calls it the Sea of Tiberias. Sea of Galilee would be better known to a Jewish audience, which may suggest that John is writing more for perhaps a Roman context. Of course, the tradition is the Gospel of John was written at Ephesus, and so it may very well be that a mostly Gentile Ephesian community would have understood the reference to the Sea of Tiberias better than the reference to the Sea of Galilee. Of course, it's the same sea. Basically, I believe it was Herod Agrippa, Herod Antipas, the one that beheaded John the Baptist, built a city in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius was emperor when Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. And so Tiberias was an important city, became a tourist spot back in the first century. So it was perhaps more widely known in the empire as the Sea of Tiberias, which again, a hint to perhaps the setting of the Gospel of John. So now he manifested himself thus, verse 2. There were together Simon, Peter, and Thomas, the one called Didymus, and Nathanael, the one from Cana of Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Now, this is very interesting. Peter, we're not surprised that Peter's there. Thomas and Nathanael, of course, Nathanael's not mentioned in any of the other Gospels. Some have wondered if maybe this is another name for Bartholomew, perhaps, because in the list, the names of the 12 disciples can differ a little bit. Perhaps Nathanael is taking the place of Bartholomew or something along those lines. But Nathanael is mentioned earlier in the gospel. Jesus says he's someone who is without guile. And Nathanael's impressed that Jesus would know anything about him at all. Thomas the twin, who of course doubted at first in the previous chapter. Jesus appeared to him 8 days later. I guess we are 7 days from, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Oh, okay, we're on the 8th day, I guess. It's the next Sunday, as it were. Okay, so sons of Zebedee are James and John, and then two others. Now, one of these is the beloved disciple. And so that's the great, it's almost like the author is being deliberately cryptic, right? Which one of these is the beloved disciple? Tradition is, of course, that it's John, the son of Zebedee. But we've talked in the past about how there are some questions about whether that is the case or not. It may very well be that the beloved disciple is one of these two anonymous ones. We just don't know. One of those things we put on the list and say, I'd like to ask somebody about that when I get to heaven. Verse 3, Simon Peter says to them, I'm going to fish, because you got to eat, right? It may also suggest that there wasn't immediate certainty with regard to what came next. You wonder. Jesus appears to Peter first, although Luke doesn't tell us exactly where that was. Paul says that as well, but doesn't say where it was. But Jesus appears to Peter. Has the Great Commission happened? Maybe the Great Commission hasn't happened yet. So what are we going to do? We know Jesus is risen from the dead. If you go with Mark, he said he's going to appear to us in Galilee. Well, when's he going to appear to us? Good question. So eventually, Peter says, let's go fish. And they say to him, we are coming with you also. There's nothing to do here. Let's go fishing. They went out and they went up into the boat, and in the night they seized nothing. They caught nothing. So not a particularly successful night of fishing. Got to be frustrating. And now, it having become early, Jesus stood on the shore. Not, however, did the disciples know that it was Jesus. So Jesus is on the shore. They're about, 20 yards off. They're a little bit off from the shore, not too far off. They see somebody, perhaps it's dark, I assume, not real light yet. They see somebody. They don't know it's Jesus. Verse 5, Jesus says to them, children, are you not having any fish? And they answered, no. So they're close enough to the shore that they can have this shouting conversation. Verse 6, and he said to them, well, cast on the right side of the boat, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find something there. Therefore, they cast it, and no longer were they strong to drag it in from the multitude of the fish. And you might remember there was another incident, I think it's in Luke 5, where basically Jesus tells them to go out. I think it's to go out further, maybe, and they catch lots of fish. But this is a scene they know. Verse 7, therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved says to Peter, it's the Lord. So once again, the beloved disciple is quicker to recognize the working of God than the others. Remember, he was the first to put the tomb. He didn't go in. Peter went in first. He's the one that Peter has to ask. There's kind of a little bit of a sibling rivalry here, or disciple rivalry, not necessarily from the beloved disciple himself, but maybe from the beloved disciples' community, if they had something to do with putting the Gospel of John into its final form, after the beloved disciple had passed. But he sees. Remember, at the tomb, he's the first to believe. Peter's like, what's going on here? But he believes. Here, the beloved disciple immediately recognizes it's the Lord. Therefore, Simon Peter, having heard that it's the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was naked. Now, I don't know whether naked here means fully naked. They're a bunch of guys. Jewish customs are maybe different from some of ours. As far as I know, the guys that I know that go fishing together don't necessarily do this. But it may be that Peter had some sort of covering, but not entirely. So he put something on. Put some clothes on, Peter. So he cast himself into the sea. Notice they've, according to the Gospel of, I think it's the Gospel of John, where with Mary and Martha, Martha's concerned about many things, but Mary is concerned about the most important thing, and that is being with Jesus. Maybe we have a little bit of the same here. You got the group. What about these fish, Peter? Peter does. We give it to him that he recognizes the important thing. which is to be with Jesus. He jumps in the water. You guys take care of the fish. I'm out of here. He cast himself into the sea. Verse 8, and the other disciples came in the boat, for they were not far from the land. They were about 200 cubits. Okay, not 20 yards, 200 cubits. Trying to figure out what that is. A cubit is about a half a yard. So that's maybe 100 yards if my math is working there. So they're about 100 yards off. And they come dragging the net of the fish. Verse 9. Therefore, as they got out of the boat, they see the coals lying and the fish lying on it and bread. So Jesus already has some stuff. Verse 10, Jesus says to them, bring from the fish that you have caught now. Now Peter helps. Peter went to see Jesus first, but now he goes and helps. Therefore, Simon Peter went up and he drew the net to the land full of large fish, 153. There's been a lot of musing about what is the 153? What does it mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? And of course, there's some who says it doesn't mean anything. That's just how many fish there were. But the Gospel of John is a very symbolic gospel, right? So we suspect that there's probably some significance to it beyond just that's how many there were. And if you take 12 times 12, you have 144. 12 is a key symbolic number in the Bible and disciples and number of children of Israel. 144,000 is a symbolic for all those who will be saved of Israel in the book of Revelation. So we can see 144 having a symbolic number, 12 squared. Then if you add the number of the surviving disciples, because remember Judas is gone, but if you add the 11 to 144, you get 153. So it may very well be that this is symbolic of the mission to the whole world, to go, I will make you fishers of men. Anyway, so he's going to make them fishers of men, and they're going to recruit the whole world. That might be the symbolism of it, or not. It doesn't tell us, right? And although being so many, the net was not torn. The net will hold. The church will hold that many. The people of God will hold that many additions. It's not going to rip. By the way, it did rip in Luke 5 or wherever it was that the other hall was, it seems to me. Verse 12, Jesus says to them, come, eat breakfast. And no one dared of the disciples to ask him, who are you? For those of you watching, I just accidentally clicked on the vocabulary word for disciple. Now we're back. None of them dared ask who he was, who are you, because they were knowing it was the Lord. This again suggests that there's something a little different about the way Jesus looks. They can recognize him more spiritually than physically. They know it's the Lord. And of course, there's going to be a conversation in a second that makes it very clear that it's the Lord as we get a little further, because the Lord wouldn't know what to ask Peter if it wasn't Jesus. So nobody asks him. They know it's the Lord. Verse 13, Jesus comes and takes the bread and gives to them, and similarly the fish. And this is verse 14. This is the third time Jesus revealed himself to the disciples after he had risen from the dead. Now, we should say third time in John. John counts these things, but the counting is not an absolute count. So like when he talks about this is the first sign that was done, this is the second sign, there are more signs in between the first and the second sign. So we shouldn't worry about making this the third appearance in relation to the other Gospels. We don't have to worry about that. He appears to Mary, he appears to the disciples in the evening, and here it says it's the third time. Anyway, so we don't have to worry about it being an absolute number. Think of it as the third time in the Gospel of John, and the third time to the core disciples, right? Because it doesn't count Mary. You've got a first the night of Easter, and then you've got to Thomas 8 days later, and then you've got this one. Again, I don't think we should worry about that being an absolute kind of number. Breaking of bread. Notice that it was in the breaking of the bread that Jesus was revealed to the men on the road to Emmaus. There's something very Christian about breaking bread together. And of course, communion was originally more of a meal rather than a set-alone little ceremony. Okay, so verse 15. Therefore, when they had dined, He says to Simon Peter, that is, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He says to him, feed or tend my lambs. Okay, now the verbs here, there's a lot of lore about the verbs for love in this sequence. So Jesus says, do you agapao me more than these? And Peter says, yes, you know I phileo you. Now, there's been a tendency to say, Jesus is asking, do you love me on the highest love, agape? And Peter says, Lord, you know that I love you on a lower love, phileo. And he says this 3 times, and then the 3rd time Jesus comes down to his level and Peter is grieved. Most scholars do not think that there is a distinction here between agapao and phileo. They seem to be roughly synonymous. I've heard pastors say, we're not capable of agape, and so God will take from us phileo. That does not seem to be the point of this. So for one thing, agapao probably won't bear the load that we want it to in terms of what the word meant. For example, in the Greek Old Testament, do you remember when Amnon rapes his sister Tamar? He says there, I agapao my sister. And so obviously that's not, agapao there is not limited to this perfect kind of godly love in the background of the language, because Amnon says that he loves her, and he really means he lusts her. So first of all, linguistically, the history of this word won't bear what we want it to. The second thing is that John varies the synonyms here clearly. Like here it says in verse 15, feed the lambs, but then in the next sequence he says, shepherd the sheep. So he uses a different word for sheep even there. These are synonymous. And so the vast majority of John scholars don't actually think that any point is being made by the variation of and I hate to be a party pooper here, but there doesn't actually seem to be any intended differential between agapao love and phileo love in this passage. Jesus, what grieves Peter is that he asks him 3 times, not that he shifts the word for love. But basically, Jesus is charging Peter with the church, right? He is the core apostle in the church. And so Jesus is telling him to feed his sheep, that is the church, to tend the flock after he goes to heaven. So that's the first exchange. Here's the second one. Jesus says to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you agapao me? Peter says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. He says to him, tend, not feed, my sheep, not lambs. So again, there's a variation of synonyms. Verse 17, he says to him the 3rd time, Simon, son of John, do you phileo me? And here's where some think, Peter is not capable of agapaoing him, so he's come down to his level and phileoing him. That doesn't seem to be what's the point here. But Peter was grieved that he said to him the 3rd time, do you love me? It's the 3rd time that grieves Peter, because it's a reminder that he denied Jesus 3 times. So can I really count on you, Peter, to feed my sheep when you denied me once before? You said you wouldn't, but you did deny me before. So can I count on you this time? And Peter is grieved that Jesus asked him 3 times. But he says to him, Lord, you know everything, and you know that I love you. I phileo you. You know that I love you. Therefore, Jesus says to him, tend my sheep. So he mixes and matches the words from before there. So now Jesus is going to give a prediction. Verse 18, truly, truly, amen, amen, I say to you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you were walking around wherever you wanted to. But whenever you should be old, you will stretch out your hands and another person will dress you and will bring you where you do not want to go. Verse 19, This he said, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And having said this, Jesus says to him, "Follow me." This is, of course, the tradition that Peter was crucified. One tradition says he was crucified upside down, but that Peter was crucified under the Emperor Nero. That seems to be a fairly reliable tradition. And here, the Gospel of John, which would have been written several decades, I believe, after that event. When did it happen? We don't know for sure. It could have happened around 64. We know there was a mass persecution and martyrdom of Christians around the year 64 under Nero. But of course, Nero lived until he committed suicide in the year 68. So could have been any time in the 60s, in theory, when Peter was crucified. So he stretches out his hands and he basically says, "This is how you're going to die." And so Peter did emulate Jesus in his death and was faithful unto death, according to everything that we know. First Clement mentions the death of Peter and Paul and presumably as a martyr's death. So verse 20. Peter, having turned, he sees the disciple whom Jesus loved following, who had also reclined at the supper at his bosom. And he said, "Lord, what about?" He's the one who said, "Lord, who is betraying you?" Or asked him to ask Jesus who was betraying him. Remember at the Lord's Supper, Peter was further away from Jesus than the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple was right next to Jesus and leaning on him. And may have been a younger man. Maybe, some would say Lazarus, because it says, "Look how he loved Lazarus." Could have been John Mark, who knows? Although that doesn't fit with the tradition, and it's a little complicated because the Gospel of John is quite different from the Gospel of Mark. We'd have to change our sense of who wrote Mark, probably, if we did something like that. But here, John is reminding us, or we are being reminded of who this beloved disciple is. Verse 21, "Therefore, having seen him," Peter, having seen this one, Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, what about this one?" So is he going to die too? Is he going to die on a cross? Is he going to die a martyr's death? Again, little competition between the beloved disciple and Peter here. Verse 22, Jesus says to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what's that to you? Follow me. Don't worry about him. Mind your own business, Peter." Verse 23, "Therefore, this word went out among the brothers that disciple would not die." But he clarifies, Jesus did not say that he wouldn't die, but he said, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you?" So we're getting a little picture of the later first century church. Apparently, the beloved disciple outlived the other disciples. And so there was a rumor that he was going to make it until Jesus returned. Of course, initially, they probably all thought that they would still be here when Jesus returned. What does Mark 9:1 say? "There are some standing here who will not taste death until the kingdom comes with power." Mark 13, "This generation will not pass until all these things come fulfilled." So there were no doubt some people who thought that all the disciples would. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, says, because of this present age, it's better not to marry. 1 Timothy 5 has a slightly different emphasis, perhaps having come to grips with the fact that some people would, in fact, get old and die before the Lord returned. And that was the case, because he tells Peter, "When you're old." So the Gospel of John is, of course, probably the last gospel probably written in the 90s. And so, these things are now in the past when they're being recorded by the community. This is probably where the tradition that John the son of Zebedee was the only one not martyred probably develops out of this exchange. But of course, I suspect that by the time John reached its final form, this beloved disciple probably had finally died. And that would explain some of the clarification here. And so if John's community kind of put the final edit on the Gospel of John, which there can be an inspired edit. It doesn't have to be written all in one setting by one author for it to be inspired. Verse 24 reads more like somebody writing about the beloved disciple than the beloved disciple talking about himself. Verse 24, this is the disciple who witnessed concerning these things, and the one who wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true. That would be an odd thing to say about yourself, I think. Ken's the one that wrote this book, and he's a pretty smart guy. That I wouldn't do that. This makes more sense as a kind of a epilogue or a postscript written by his community, basically saying that the Gospel of John, its source was this beloved disciple. Again, I could be wrong on that. I mean, you can refer to yourself in the third person. That's possible. Verse 25. And there are many other things also that Jesus did, which, if they are written, every one, even I think the whole world would not have the space for the books to be written. So, I look forward when we get to heaven or when the kingdom comes to finding out some of those other things that Jesus did that weren't written in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But here endeth the Gospel of John. Here endeth our resurrection series, and this is Through the Bible in 10 plus years.